The cup of the Lord is not to be denied to the lay people. For both parts of the Lord's sacrament, by Christ's ordinance and commandment, ought to be ministered to all Christian men alike. It was Article 30 from the 39 Articles as adopted by the Episcopal Church in 1801. It can be found in your prayer book on page 874. Among the fundamental commitments of the Protestant reformers in England, our ancestors in the faith, was the belief that the church return to its original practice of offering communion to all Christians, whether ordained or not, in both kinds, that is, as bread and wine. Distribution of the sacrament in the form of both bread and wine to all baptized Christians was the most ancient practice of the church. But this practice fell out of favor in the Middle Ages. Lay people began to receive the sacraments less frequently, and when they did, they were not permitted to consume consecrated wine. The Western Church, through a doctrine called concomitance, has long affirmed that in receiving bread alone, one receives the full benefits, the full grace of Holy Communion. This is important to remember even today. A person who is allergic to alcohol, for example, still receives the full grace of the Eucharist even if they receive bread alone when they take communion. While affirming this doctrine, though, the reformers in England wanted to reach back to the early years of the church and resurrect communion in both kinds. To the English reformers, denial of wine to the people contravened both the example and the command of Jesus, who gave his disciples bread and wine at the Last Supper. The quote with which I began demonstrates this. Though the article first appears in the American Prayer Book in 1801, it dates back to the 16th century and was among the earliest articles of faith put forward by the leaders of what would become the Church of England, the mother church of global Anglicanism and our Episcopal Church. The reformers believed deeply in reception of bread and wine by the laity. Though we don't always remember this, there were diverse ways of distributing bread and wine in the early church, a diversity which eventually dwindled in the medieval West as uniformity of practice became expected. With the Reformation, a diversity of practice around Holy Communion once again emerged. As Episcopalians, as Anglicans, we are a part of that diversity of expression, even though in most ways our practice of Holy Eucharist, that is, our sacramental theology, is strikingly similar to that of our Roman Catholic siblings in the faith. The normative practice in Anglican or Episcopal churches is for the priest to consecrate wine in one common chalice, while also consecrating wine in a cruet, a pitcher that can be used to pour into a second shared chalice or more shared chalices in large congregations, but always shared, always common cups. The symbol is important to us. It is a common cup, a shared cup, one that we share with Christ and one another. We who are many are one body because we share one bread, one cup. Other denominations may do it differently, but this is our practice based on the traditions that we have received. I'm offering this very short history because we are at a moment in the life of the church that is testing our commitments around the sacrament of Holy Communion. Different denominations and even different churches within denominations have responded in diverse ways to the pressures of the pandemic on our sacramental life. Churches have been faced with questions. What do we do as a sacramental church when we cannot gather for Holy Communion? Or if only a few of us feel safe gathering in person for communion? Is there such a thing as a virtual sacrament? What message does it send if only clergy are able to receive wine at communion? Can we share a common loaf, a common cup in a time of pandemic? Those are just a few of the questions we've been faced with. At St. Anne's, we've been walking this journey together for nearly 2 years, trying to make decisions about our common life that align with the sacramental theology of the Episcopal Church, the guidance of the Bishop of Chicago, and the public health guidance and legal requirements of the state of Illinois. In the earliest days of the pandemic, the decision was made for us. Our doors were closed, and we simply did not have access to the sacrament of Holy Communion. Later, we reopened with limited capacity, and each Sunday, the sacrament was available to some, but not all, of our community. So we set up a live stream, included a prayer for spiritual communion so that people could be virtually present, if not present physically. And it's worth noting that some in our parish now primarily worship in this way, worshiping as a part of our community while having no access to the physical sacrament. In 2020, drinking from a common chalice was deemed unsafe and prohibited by the Bishop of Chicago, as was the use of common loaves of bread, delicious bread at St. Anne's, I have to add, bread that was broken up to distribute to the people. This was prohibited. So when we resumed distribution of communion after the first shutdown, we moved to communion hosts and also relied on this doctrine of concomitance and didn't offer wine at all to the laity. Lay people still received the full grace of Holy Communion, of course, but could not physically receive wine. This was a stopgap measure, and no one understood it to be perfect or permanent. As the pandemic wore on, though, many clergy, myself included, became uncomfortable with how long we were asking our parishioners to go without receiving communion in both kinds. Some clergy wished to return to a common cup immediately, arguing that the sacrament was worth the risk. And some have relied on data from earlier epidemics to argue that there's little risk in a common cup. Some dioceses in the Episcopal Church have allowed the common chalice to resume, though the overwhelming majority have not, and it is still expressly prohibited in this diocese. Other clergy considered a deviation from normative Anglican practice and moved to distribute communion wine in a way that is common among many Protestants, but not among Episcopalians, communion in individual cups. It seems to me that due to the pressures of the pandemic, our values are competing with one another in the current moment. The first value is the Protestant, Anglican, Episcopal commitment to ensure that all God's people have access to the fullness of the sacramental life of the church. In communion, this means access to bread and wine. The second value is the normative Anglican practice of communion from a common chalice as an important symbol of our unity. A third value is the desire to keep people safe, both by promoting actual physical safety and health and by promoting a feeling of safety in church. Leaders in congregations, lay and ordained, must make many challenging choices about our common life during the pandemic, but it falls on the bishop and the clergy to decide how to balance competing interests in our sacramental life and our worship life in a time like the one we are living in. And so on All Saints Sunday, due to my belief that we had gone too long without communion in both kinds for the laity, St. Anne's resumed distribution of wine to the people. We did this with permission of the bishop-elect. This was allowed only if we first consecrated the wine in a common cruet, keeping to the tradition, and then poured it into individual chalices. Hence the current pause in our service after the consecration and before we distribute communion. It takes some time to pour wine in all the little cups. After the trial run on All Saints, we resumed distribution of wine every Sunday, beginning on the first Sunday of Advent, again on a trial basis. And since that time, the assisting bishop has updated the guidance to the clergy. We are now permitted on a temporary basis during the pandemic to consecrate wine in the individual cups. So at St. Anne's, beginning this weekend, communion wine will be consecrated in the small cups before it is distributed to the people. The assisting bishop has expressed some discomfort with this, discomfort with which I share. This is not an ideal solution, and it is a significant departure from the normative Anglican practice, which directs us towards unity of the cups. The assisting bishop has made it clear, and again, I agree that this is a temporary measure. When it is again deemed safe to use a common chalice as a symbol of our unity, St. Anne's will return to that practice. Now, it may seem odd that I'm taking care and all this time to explain in detail my decision-making process on this matter. To some, it may seem like no big deal to use individual cups. while others may strongly believe that we should return immediately to a common chalice in keeping with our tradition. Still others may think we have bigger fish to fry and that we should be focused on other stuff. I'm taking time to lay this out to you, though, because as Christians in the Anglican tradition, we believe that how we worship matters. The forms of worship matter. The Holy Eucharist is the central act of Christian worship, and changes to the fundamentals of that worship deserve careful thought and discussion. I've struggled over the last 2 years with how to keep my ordination vows and the Eucharistic traditions as we have received them in our church, while also keeping the congregation safe, and while also providing access to meaningful sacramental worship. I've struggled deeply with this decision this week. And to be perfectly honest, I'm still not 100% sure of the decision that I've made. Still, balancing the values of access to the sacrament and the traditional practice of the church, I've decided to lean in the direction of the former. So we will adjust our practice to ensure that all have access to the sacrament in its fullness. With this in mind, I'll also be offering an option for people to drive up to the church, drive through at the church after watching the live stream, to receive communion in a way that feels safe to those worshiping from home. And of course, I'm also available to deliver communion that has been consecrated at our Sunday services to your home. We can have communion on the porch together. I also place this matter before you in detail because we have an opportunity to reflect together on our sacramental life. The disruptions of the last 2 years have given us a chance to reflect on why we do what we do, and what it means to us, what it teaches us about God and one another. So reflect. How does this way of communion, the receiving communion, feel to you? Why do you think that is? What does it matter if we use real bread or hosts, if we use a single cup or individual cups? Does it matter? As a priest in the church, I certainly think it does, but do you think it matters? Liturgy is the work of all the people, so I want us all to take time to reflect on this. And a few more mundane but no less important details. For the time being, we're still using the small olive wood chalices. Any wine left in them is reverently disposed of, then they're washed in soap and water and sanitized with hydrogen peroxide. Now, this constant washing will eventually degrade the wood to where it's unsafe, so we have ordered recyclable plastic cups and trays for use in communion, similar to what you have seen in other Protestant churches. Again, before the cups are recycled, any wine in them will be reverently disposed of. Our practice is to rinse the chalices, the cups, into a special drain called a piscina so that the wine is fed directly into the earth and does not go down a sewage drain. This, by the way, is also how we dispose of holy water, the original use of a piscina. So though we're deviating from some forms of Anglican Eucharistic practice, we are still taking great care with the bread and wine made holy, the body and blood of Christ. And let me close by reiterating that this is the beginning of a conversation, not the end. Our practice is shifting, and I want to be clear, this is on a temporary basis. But I'm happy to discuss this with any who so desire. I'll be available after church on Sunday to discuss. I'll take questions in person, and I think we'll leave the live stream going and take comments or questions from the YouTube chat if there are any. Or you can reach out to me for time to talk one-on-one. We'll keep doing this together, keep talking together. Together, let us keep the faith, and together, let us keep the feast. Now a word from the Apostle Paul from 1 Corinthians chapter 11. For I received from the Lord what I also handed on to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took a loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body that is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." Amen.